my talk will be on the security of distance measurement, in particular ultra-wideband distance measurement, and I will say why I believe this is an important topic in a minute. So we all, or a lot of you might have seen these kind of videos where a car is being stolen essentially by something that is widely known as a relay attack. That's something that we did in 2011, so more than 10 years ago now, where as you might notice, one of the attackers is standing close to the doors of the car, and the other one is essentially standing close to the house doors. And what's happening is that the one with his hands up in the air is holds an antenna and is trying to excite the key fob that's in the car, and then some relay happens between the key fob and the car, and the car opens because it believes that it's closer, that is close to the key fob, when in fact the key fob is in the house. So, and this is a conventional problem of secure distance measurement, where essentially two adversaries perform some sort of a manipulation of the communication between the key fob and the car, and convince these two devices that they are closer than they actually are. And the problem that we have if we want to build a secure distance measurement system is that we want to prevent the manipulation of measured distance. Now, in most scenarios, be it payments or physical access control to locks and cars and so forth, this problem essentially is a problem of preventing distance reduction rather than preventing distance enlargement. So in most of these scenarios, distance enlargement is not such a, there's no benefit for the adversary. So the adversary focuses on reducing distance, because then he or she can open the car or simply relay some sort of a payment or do something else, right? So there is a broad application space here. It's not only about cars, it's about access control and payments and tracking and all kinds of automation that can be based on this notion of distance or position, right? Because naturally from distances we can also get positions. So, and my argument here is that we essentially need ranging. So we need this distance measurement that is secure from all logical and also physical layer attacks. So if you look at this problem of unlocking the car, on the logical layer, there was not much that went wrong, right? Because it's a challenge response protocol. There was some measurement being done in terms of the received signal strength between the car and the key fob, right? So there was some notion of proximity that was built into the protocol, right? And the cryptography wasn't affected, right? I mean, crypto was intact. The only thing that the adversaries did, and what we did back in 2011, was essentially that we amplified the signals in such a way that the key fob and the car appeared closer than they are. So we violated something on the physical layer, communication layer, and we didn't really touch the data layer or the logical layer. And so this brings a problem. This of course now brings the question of, okay, how should we build secure ranging? Well, then we should build it in such a way that it should be secure from logical and physical layer attacks, and essentially should not depend on the context or attacker's abilities, right? I mean, it should somehow be well defined as our ciphers are, or message authentication codes are, in the sense that we know what kind of we know that we can take them and place them in any context, and irrespective of the messages, they are going to provide the properties that they need to provide. At least in general, that's what we aim for, right? So secure position. So in the same way, secure ranging and secure positioning should be somehow context independent. So it should work without us having to make assumptions on the locations of the adversaries. So for example, that the adversary needs to be close or further away for an attack to succeed. So irrespective of the adversary's locations, it should be these secure distance measurements should hold. And also importantly, of course, it should cryptographically bind distance to identity, so that you know the entity with which you are ranging. So that's another important characteristic that clearly is clear from this scenario, that we need a particular key fob and not just a key fob. In this talk, I will focus mainly on 802.15.4z, which is a new standard. It was essentially approved in 2020, right? And it focuses on the prevention of distance reduction attacks. The reason why I'm going to talk about this standard and how it provides, or which modes of this standard might provide secure ranging and which might not, is that it's now widely deployed in many application areas. And also, not only that ultra-wideband is currently being widely deployed, so in our phones and in cars and other IoT devices, but also that throughout the last 10 years, there were a lot of investigations of ranging technologies, and a lot of research has been put into understanding which types of ranging can be or cannot be made secure under different attacker models, right? And what emerged somehow is that ultra-wideband, due to the very narrow, very short pulses that it uses to modulate the data, emerged as some sort of a, let's say, a good physical layer basis for secure ranging. And on top of it, it provides high level of precision compared to some other technologies like received signal strength. So as you can see from this slide, a number of other technologies have been shown to be insecure, or at least vulnerable to a number of attacks. And ultra-wideband currently is a very good basis, and we have some modes that are actually secure against arbitrary adversaries. Ultra-wideband is not the only technology that is being standardized for secure ranging. There are now efforts also within 802.11, AZ, and also within 5G to achieve secure ranging. So I expect more to be done in this space. So why is ultra-wideband interesting? Well, it has already been deployed, even if the standard is now only a year old. The industry has been working on this for some years. We were from the side of ETH and also an ETH spin-off 3DB, we're also involved in the standardization efforts. So this has been happening already for some years. And so there are two modes in this standard. One mode is a low rate pulse mode, LRP, and the other one is a high rate pulse mode, HRP. And they're used, LRP primarily currently in automotive, HRP is used in automotive, but also has been deployed already also in smartphones and smart tags. There are also standardization bodies like FIRA and Car Connectivity Consortium that are integrating ultra-wideband as the underlying technology for secure ranging. Now, LRP mode, as we will discuss, is open, whereas HRP mode is actually, so the security of HRP mode is closed and proprietary. However, this didn't prevent us from launching some of the attacks on this mode, as we'll see in this talk. So in this talk, what I want to show you are practical distance reduction attacks on the HRP mode of ranging. So this is a mode currently used by iPhone, AirTags, by in NXP chips and Qorvo chips. Qorvo is essentially, it's a decawave technology, right? That has been decawave having been acquired by Qorvo. And then I will try to step back and describe the main challenges in securing ultra-wideband ranging in general, right? Both from the logical and physical layer, and also I will compare the security designs of HRP and LRP. So first, the sort of fun part of the talk is the new attack code that we named GhostPeak, something that we did in collaboration with TU Darmstadt. So these are attacks on HRP ultra-wideband ranging, so So to give you a little bit of an intuition how this HRP ranging works, well, it's essentially a challenge response protocol, right? So it's a challenge response protocol in which packets are being exchanged between the sender and the receiver, right? So it's a simple protocol where a car sends a challenge to the key fob. The key fob replies with a response, and the round trip time is measured, right? And that's fine. So these packets that are being sent are of the form that you can see here on the slides. So the victim here is transmitting this packet, right, as a part of its challenge or a part of the response. It doesn't really matter. So it contains, it has some preamble, some random sequence. So this random sequence is a security feature of this protocol. This random sequence here is something that should be unguessable to the adversary, right? So something that the adversary cannot guess and therefore cannot advance, right? Send in advance. And then there is some potentially payload which is optional. So the main idea of our attack is to try to fool the time of arrival process at the receiver. What does that mean? This means that we want to craft messages, and you see the attacker's message here above, right? I mean, I'm giving you only the intuition here, so I don't expect everyone to understand all the details here. But as you can see, our attack involves injecting different parts of the packet at different power levels without knowing essentially the random bits that are being used in this protocol. So we don't know what the random bits are that are being used by the victim. We are going to inject this red packet here. Now, our assumptions here are clearly we have no knowledge of the keys shared between victim devices. We have no ability to predict this scrambled timing sequence, so this random sequence that is shared between the car and the key fob. And we have a very inexpensive setup, so a commercial off-the-shelf device. And so what happens when we inject such a message? Well, the main results are essentially shown here. So here we have an iPhone, which is an initiator, and we have an NXP chip here, which is a responder. So the iPhone and this NXP chip, they play a challenge response protocol, exchanging the types of packets that we have seen. We have here our attacker, which injects these carefully crafted packets that have different fields at different power levels. And this results in a reduction of the distance that is measured between the iPhone and the NXP chip to 0 meters, as you can see here, right? And here is another experiment where we do the same with iPhone to iPhone measurements, right? So a reduction from 10 meters to less than 2 meters that we have seen in our log. So these are two concrete examples of distance reduction attacks, and this shows you that something is off, right? There were random messages being sent, random bits being sent by the victims, right? And there was an injection of the adversary that was done without the a priori knowledge of those random bits, that caused these devices to measure a shorter distance than the one at which they truly are. Meaning that now, for example, if this was an iPhone and the car here, the car would unlock. This means that there is something in the time of arrival algorithm that these chips use that is not robust to this kind of manipulations. And we will see later on why this is the case. This just shows you here a little bit more of how this looks in practice, right? I mean, so if we turn our attack on, we have some distance reduction with different probabilities and at different distances, and here we have some. Here the attack is off, so the correct distance is being measured. So this is just to show that essentially if you don't do the attack, everything is fine. If you do the attack, the distance will be shortened. So if you look at the statistics of this a bit more carefully across iPhone and HomePod Mini, for example, in a scenario where a music needs to be activated, for example, or iPhone to iPhone interaction, or AirTag to iPhone interaction, or with NXP and Corvo chips. You can see that we have different success rates and also different reductions in terms of the reductions of the distance. And this evaluation was done black box using the modes and configurations that we were able to access on those chips. There was a lot of essentially, reverse engineering, if you want, that happened there to understand how these devices work and what kind of parameters can be set and how we can inject the messages. And again, all of this was done without any knowledge of the shared keys between the devices. It's essentially, the attacker operates essentially in a Dolev-Yao manner. And as a result, NXP decided to change some of the wording on their sites. I mean, we're still not really clear what they mean by this. They changed one of their chips from secure to reliable. I don't understand their terminology. They changed this to reliable here, but then somehow it's still under secure ultra-wideband, even if it's clear from our experiments that this is not secure. Okay, so now that we have covered this kind of warm-up experiment, and if I hopefully got your attention, now let's step back and understand what are the main challenges in securing such HRP ranging. So, as I mentioned earlier, these secure ranging protocols at the logical layer are relatively simple. Unlike distance bounding protocols that were talked about in the community for the last 10 years, these ranging protocols do not use any form of rapid bit exchange. In fact, they use ranging happens over packets and not over individual bits. And this can actually be done securely, despite some of the previous results where people thought that this cannot be done. This actually can be done securely, as we will show. So the principle is simple. We have one of the devices issues a challenge, which is random, unguessable to the adversary. So this here would be this scramble timing sequence in HRP. And the prover is going to process this challenge, respond with some cryptographically produced NP, right? That will again be unguessable to the adversary, and the round trip time of flight will be measured. Now the adversary clearly, since he cannot guess NV and NP in advance before they're sent, he cannot shorten this distance. He can only enlarge this distance, and that's the unpredictability of these messages is essentially what should keep these protocols secure. So the main idea is that this STS here, which in the HRP standard is being sent as a part of the packet, right, cannot be predicted by M, and that's the core security feature of the high rate pulse mode. In LRP mode, which is the second mode of 802.15.4z, there is another sequence, essentially random payload, which is used for the same purpose. So in that sense, these two modes are pretty similar, right? There are some other fields around, but those are like a preamble, fixed and known to the adversary. What the adversary cannot guess is this STS sequence. So this design prevents logical layer attacks, but of course, ranging needs to be protected against physical layer attacks, and that's what we want to explore in a bit more. And in order to understand this, we need to understand how bits are encoded in ultra-wideband, right? So ultra-wideband, as its basis, has pulses, and these pulses are short, 1 to 2 nanosecond wide pulses. So they are, ultra-wideband occupies a large bandwidth, so 500 plus megahertz, and so these pulses are very short. And however, of course, one can then use or encode bits into individual pulses, or one can present bits by multiple ultra-wideband pulses in order to gain robustness and distance, right? Individual pulses might be lost and also might not be strong enough in order to be detected at the receiver. So in some way, and this is of course on a very high level, the pulses are essentially, so the bits are being demodulated into across multiple pulses. So longer symbols increase the range and robustness to noise and multipath, right? So in this example, right, we have this very simple example where bit 1 is 4 pulses, 4 positive pulses, and bit 0 is 4 negative pulses. Now this positive and negative can be realized through on-off keying, can be realized through phase, or some other, or in some other way, but that would be too many details now. But just keep in mind that we have these two polarities, right? Now this is maybe a little bit of an overloaded slide, but it's very important to understand. So 4Z defines two different modes, so LRP and HRP, and on the surface they don't seem all that different, right? So in one mode you transmit fewer pulses in a span of fewer, you have a low rate, right? So you transmit fewer pulses, and in the other one you transmit essentially with a higher rate, right? So the question is why does this even matter, right? It would be just a tunable parameter. Well, it matters because given its wide bandwidth, ultra wideband has a potential to interfere with a lot of other technologies. So what the regulations do is that they limit the mean power across a 1 millisecond window, and also limit the peak power of ultra-wideband pulses. This means that you can either transmit many pulses over 1 millisecond, but at a low power each, or you can transmit fewer pulses, but at a high power each, again with a peak power limit. Now, this means that essentially in the LRP mode, where you transmit few pulses, and these pulses are roughly then hundreds of nanoseconds apart, these pulses are strong enough to be seen by the receiver for most applications, and that means that you have a choice to represent each bit by single or multiple pulses, right? And also this somewhat simplified design. I mean, as another choice in LRP is that this is a non-coherent receiver, so it's somewhat simpler to build. Now in the HRP mode, the modulation is a bit more complicated, and also the pulses are tightly placed together, right? So they are few nanoseconds apart, and also they need to be transmitted at a low power, which means that there will be very few scenarios where you can decode individual pulses. You will only be able to see aggregated pulses, right? And so this means that in LRP we can decode individual pulses. So our secure payload, for example, can have 32, 64, 128 random pulses, right? Which we can then use to secure arranging. And in HRP we cannot decode individual pulses, but we have this long scramble timing sequence, which is 4,000 pulses long. And now the question is, how do we demodulate that, right? I mean, what do we do with this STS sequence? You know, how do we build the security on top of this random sequence of many pulses, which we cannot decode individually, right? So we have to have some sort of an aggregation function that tells us, hey, this is a correct sequence. So what HRP does essentially is it does something similar to what GPS does, right? I mean, so it correlates at the receiver the received scramble time sequence with the locally generated copy of this sequence to determine the time of arrival. So there is something called, so there is a public preamble in the packets of HRP, but there is also a scramble timestamp sequence, which is these 4,000 random pulses that are transmitted by the sender and then need to be correlated at the receiver in order to obtain the time of arrival, right? Now, if this is shifted in time left or right, you will obtain a different time of arrival. Right? So this sounds kind of good, right? I mean, you decide on the arrival time based on the autocorrelation peak that you receive. Wherever the peak is the strongest, you can say, well, that's my time of arrival. And that would be nice if there would be no multipath, right? However, there are several issues here, right? Which is that in multipath-rich environments and in non-line of sight settings, which typically dominate our living, is that the maximum autocorrelation peak that you obtain, right? So here you can see the transmitted pulses. Here you see received pulses. Given that the pulses are tightly packed, the multipath of one pulse will essentially impact the adjacent pulse, and you will also see a lot of weird buildup right around, in the signal that you receive. And when you do your autocorrelation, in the end, you will obtain something that looks like this, right? You will have a maximum autocorrelation peak somewhere here, but this will actually not be this strongest autocorrelation peak will not be the true time of arrival. It will not correspond to the earliest path. So it will not correspond to the direct line of sight. It will be a buildup of a lot of reflections, and therefore, what you have to do in order to calculate this true path, this early path, you need to identify the maximum peak and then do a back search in order to find this early path, right? And now the question is, there are many algorithms how to do that, right? So you need to be clever about finding this early path here. And how do you identify this early path, right? You can reason about how weaker that can it be, or is it allowed to be from the maximum peak? You can also argue how stronger does it need to be from the average noise floor that you observe in your autocorrelation, right? So these are all these kind of parameters that you need to. And of course, if you are too generous with your thresholds, the adversary might be able to inject an earlier path. And this is what we assume essentially happened in our attacks. We were able to generate an artificial early path which somehow fit within these thresholds that are placed in these chips, right? So we were able to inject something that is in some sense random, but when the autocorrelation was generated a sufficiently strong peak, a sufficiently strong early path that fooled the receiver into calculating an earlier time of arrival. Okay. There are many other attacks on time of arrival estimation, right? So I'm not going to go through all of them. Early detect, late commit is one of them. Cicada plus, adaptive injection, now ghost peak attacks. They're all different forms of essentially the same goal. So all of them are trying to achieve the same goal, which is create a fake early peak despite not knowing the scrambled timing sequence, right? And remember here, the receiver doesn't really see individual pulses. So it's not like you can decode individual pulses, 4,000 pulses, and now you match against the sequence. No. At the receiver, you're essentially aggregating the energy across. So you're not making a decision on individual pulses, you're making a decision on the entire sequence. You're saying this sequence is similar enough to the local copy that I'm supposed to have. So all these attacks in theory, but also our ghost peak attack, which is a practical attack with real chips and devices, they show that physical layer attack on this high rate pulse mode are a real threat. What is also more worrying, especially for us as researchers, is that these companies do not really tell us how time of arrival estimation is done, right? So we know that the random 4092 pulse bit sequence is being used and is being transmitted, and we can observe that, we can record those signals, and we can see the pulses. But what we cannot do is, we don't know how they are being processed at the receiver, right? So we know that there is some autocorrelation that is being done, and we know that such ranging systems need to be looking for an early path. But what we don't know is how the thresholds are set, what kind of other features are they looking for in this autocorrelation sequence. So we don't know, right? And clearly, in order to gain any confidence in this kind of algorithms or in these kind of systems, these algorithms should be public and comprehensively evaluated. It's like having a black box cipher and having claims on its security, right? It's simply not something that we should have. So how do we move forward? Well, we have tried to do that by a series of papers. You will find some of our ideas and analysis in the papers that you see below, right? So what we want to answer for these systems is how many bits of security does a 4092 pulse long sequence provide, right? This is what you would want, right? We injected some packets sort of blindly, right, by playing with the power levels, but we don't have a quantified level of security here, where this guessing space of the adversary is known, right? Okay, so unlike HRP mode, LRP mode is actually open, so it's easier to understand, and it's actually much simpler, and it's easier to argue about its security. So this is something that we have also been playing with, mainly focusing on the performance and extending its range. So going back to this overview, so we have seen that HRP mode has its issues, right? It's also closed source, but attacks were possible or are possible on existing chips. Now, what about LRP, right? So we have seen that this mode allows for bits to be decoded, so pulses to be decoded individually, right? And for most applications, actually, that works really well, meaning that there is enough energy in these pulses that at the distance that you, for your application, let's say 10, 20 meters, you will be able to pick up individual pulses and decode them. So this makes the problem of building a secure ranging system much easier, right? Because you can then decode individual pulses, as we will see on the next slide. However, that might not be sufficient in some scenarios if you want to go further, like 100 to 200 meters. So we might also want to consider scenarios where we want to extend the range. So we want to operate at 200, 300, 500 meters, and at those distances, even LRP pulses would no longer be individually decodable. So we would need to come up with some multi-pulse mode for LRP, and I'll show you how that looks like. So first, to maybe comment on the LRP versus HRP in terms of its sort of let's say thresholds and noise and spacing. So unlike in HRP, where all these pulses, as you can see, they're tightly packed, right? So let's say two. So we have pulses which are 8 nanoseconds apart. This means that the interference so that one pulse, so the delay spread of one pulse is going to affect the other pulses. And in LRP, we don't have such a problem because we have hundreds of nanoseconds of distance between the pulses, which means that any multipath will kind of fade out by the time that you have a next pulse arriving in the receiver, and that makes this somewhat cleaner. Like, I mean, you have a lower noise floor as a result. You're not artificially raising the noise floor by interfering with yourself, right? So this leads So in general, this is good because it immediately leads to better reliability and security. Your thresholds immediately are wider, and you get more robustness to adversarial injection. But this is of course not the only thing that we get out of it, because we also get stronger pulses, right? So if we have stronger pulses, suddenly our secure ranging becomes also simpler to understand. So here's how security of how LRP operates. Right? We have a preamble here, which is a series of known pulses to the adversary and to the legitimate parties, and then there is a random payload which is known only to the legitimate parties. Right? Now this is the message that is sent from one legitimate party to another, and what will happen is that the receiver is going to measure the time of arrival over a preamble. So the preamble, it's going to measure the time of arrival over preamble, and then it's going to essentially, after it synchronizes with that preamble, it's going to start decoding individual pulses into bits. And if it receives the expected bit sequence, it knows that the range is correct. If the adversary, for example, advances the preamble, which he can do, right, because he knows the preamble, so he can transmit it earlier, the adversary would then need to guess each of these pulses, the polarity of each of these individual pulses, in order to make this to have this payload verify at the prover, right? Because otherwise, if he injects random pulses, well, the receiver will say, well, that's not correct. These pulses do not correspond to the bits that I need to receive. And since you can decode each individual pulse, you're okay, right? So, and that's essentially it, right? So you don't need to do much more if you operate in a single pulse per bit mode, right? You get one pulse, you get one bit out of it. And in some sense, it's simple. It's a concept called distance commitment that we introduced a long time ago that enables this, and it's a pretty simple scheme. Now, as I mentioned to you, it is not always possible to, even in LRP mode, to observe individual pulses. So this means that if you operate at, let's say, 300, 400, 500 meters, the strength of those pulses is going to be so weak that the receiver will not be able to decode them. So you need to do some aggregation in the same way that GPS does this, or any other receiver does this, by aggregating the energy across multiple pulses, right? Multiple locations. So how do we do that securely, right? So in order to do that securely, we need, I mean, if we would not, so it's essentially a long story, right? So there are a lot of attacks if you would simply transmit this kind of a sequence, right? So if you would transmit a preamble and then you would transmit a bit one as these 4 pulses, so 2 negative pulses and 2 positive pulses. The reason is that the adversary could, for example, just guess one of these pulses, right? You could guess one of these pulses, and if he guesses one of these pulses, he essentially guessed the entire bit. The reason is that there is an aggregation that needs to happen across multiple pulses, and you essentially sum up the energy. So if the adversary guesses any of these pulses, he essentially won the game. So what the adversary could do is to try to guess your first pulse. If he fails, he guesses the second pulse, maybe with a stronger power. If he fails, he guesses the third pulse with the strongest power, even stronger power. If he succeeds, he stops the game, and he essentially won this bit. So if your bit has, I don't know, 4 pulses, the adversary has 4 chances of winning the game, right, and defeating you on this bit, and then he can repeat this bit by bit. So in order to prevent these kind of manipulations, we came up with a scheme called pulse reordering, which is essentially a symbol interleaving scheme, where the sender and the receiver have a map how to reorder the pulses that belong to individual bits. So you see these 2 bits here, and their pulses are reordered in time, so that when the adversary sees this sequence, he doesn't know which pulse belongs to which bit, and can therefore cannot really play the above game, right? He doesn't know which of these pulses belong to which of the bits. So that's so he doesn't know when to stop the game, essentially, right? So and those are some ideas that we explored, and those are also implemented in some of the chips. So and they work pretty well. The security of LRP is actually relatively simple to analyze, at least in the single pulse per bit mode. So the probability of attacker success is just proportional, essentially, to the number of pulses that you exchange. In the multi-pulse in the multiple pulse mode with pulse reordering, the game is a little bit more complicated. It depends on how many bits you interleave and so on. But it's all public, so it can be analyzed, and it comes with, I would say, explicit security guarantees. So in conclusion, and I hope I left, I think, 15 minutes for discussion and questions. I want to make first I want to step back and make a general remark about this area, and in general about secure ranging, and that's that conceptually, what are we doing here, right? What we are doing here is we are essentially trying to solve a problem, which is a problem of the integrity of a message arrival time, right? Which is a problem which is different from the problem of message authentication, right? So when you're trying to check if the message if the integrity of the message arrival time is not violated instead of the message content, that's a different problem altogether, right? So and for that we need what we call message time of arrival codes, right? So the reason is that when you receive them, because we are all used to thinking about bits, right? And this is the abstraction that we work with. But here the decision on the bits is not so the decision to decode or what you decode is not the only decision that you make. You're also making a decision about when the message arrived at the receiver, right? So which means that you need to sample the entire signal that you receive, right? And then you have to essentially not only try to decode, but make a decision on the time of arrival, right? And so for this, we wrote a paper which is called Message Time of Arrival Codes, which tries to set this problem and formalize this problem, right? And show different message time of arrival codes, so MTACs, that examples of those, right, to sort of inspire the community to start thinking about this particular problem, because they're sort of similar to message authentication codes, but still there are significant differences in terms of how you do this. Okay, so in conclusion, Alta-Riemann provides a very strong basis for secure ranging. I would say currently no other radio technology is likely to provide stronger security guarantees. Of course, we can discuss, distances and ranges and longer symbols and so on. This is I would say, an orthogonal question, right? And within ultra-wideband, we have 2 modes, HRP and LRP. So HRP is used by a number of companies. LRP is also used by a number of companies. But HRP security algorithms are not public. We should be pushing more to make these public so that they can be analyzed. And so we need more transparency, right? Especially this, we show this through these ghost peak attacks. In LRP, we have a simple and open security design, which does not seem to suffer from the same issues like LRP. In the future, we expect more convergence between these two modes because the standardization process is not over. So there will be more discussions about how to move forward in this, I would say, exciting space. And if you want to know more about specifically this attack or secure positioning in more generally, we have this page that we registered this domain some years ago, securepositioning.com. So you will find most of our research and on that page. And I would like to thank the ERC, so the European Research Council, for supporting this research through a ERC consolidator grant, which is about to expire in February next year. But it has been an absolute essential and fantastic support. And with this, I would like to thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss.